All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. Thank you for committing to this in the few minutes before happy hour. I particularly appreciate it. Special thanks, of course, to the organizers for the time slot that is the most desired time slot of all. My name is Nathaniel Gleischer. I'm head of cybersecurity strategy at Illumio. And I have... Whoa, okay.
You gotta get where you walk.
I won't do that again. I have sort of a strange background, so it's useful to just lay it out because it gives you a little bit of a sense of why I want to talk about this. I was originally a computer scientist, software engineer, built and defended networks. And then about a decade ago, I made the somewhat questionable decision to go to law school. They trained me to put on a suit, which I have subsequently forgotten. If anyone's curious, I still write code. I do not practice law, so that might tell you something about the decision. In the interim, I spent time in the federal government investigating and prosecuting cybercrime cases for the Department of Justice here in the United States and overseas, and then working at the National Security Council as Director for Cybersecurity Policy at the White House. One of the things I did while I was in government, one of the major things that I did was track and respond to major breaches. So to try to deal with major intrusions like OPM, like Sony, and try to understand what happens and how to make it less frequent. And at the same time as I was doing that, I was actually watching the Secret Service respond to people trying to break into the White House. Because you see this, because people do this periodically, right? And the parallels were really interesting, some very depressing from the perspective of cybersecurity. And so what this talk is about is how the Secret Service functions and what we could learn from them. Because I think one of my underlying theses has always been that we tend to tell ourselves a little bit too much that network security is completely different from physical security. This is sort of one of these things that I hear a lot. It's so different, we have to start over, the network is so complicated, it changes so much. And that's certainly true. The network is very dynamic, the network changes constantly, and we have to be prepared for that. But it's not completely different. And there's actually a lot of things that we can learn from the way the Secret Service operates. So I like to start with sort of, and I'm probably going to move more, I'm sorry, that's going to be really annoying for you. I've never been good at standing still.
I left my leg up the comment.
I appreciate that. So I want to start with sort of the surprising fact for the day, right? Which is, if anyone in this room wanted to, you could jump on a plane, you could fly to Washington, D.C., and you could jump the fence at the White House, right? I guarantee you could do it. I'm not necessarily suggesting it's a good idea, but I'm sure you could. It's not very tall. It's just an iron wrought fence. And if you jump the fence at the White House, dressed however you might choose, you'll land on the lawn on the other side, and you experience this brief moment of elation and success. I've seen this many times, right? They land and they're like, yes, I made it. But if you look closely, you can already see in the back corner here the problem emerging, right? In about 10 seconds, it looks a lot more like this. The interesting thing about the White House isn't that it's actually easy to jump the fence. It's that despite that fact, it's still probably the most secure public space in the world. When someone jumps the fence at the White House, they spend seconds on the lawn. They spend minutes on the lawn, very, very short periods of time. In fact, there was a event about a month and a half ago where someone broke in and they spent 17 minutes concealed inside the White House, not the building itself, but the 18 acres around it, moving through the lawn, trying to find a way in. And it was a national news story of immense proportions, right? There were questions about whether the Secret Service had completely lost its ability to protect the president. There were inquiries. It was this huge issue. Even though the fence jumper spent the whole time on the lawn and was caught the moment they tried to get into the White House. And what's interesting to me is, if you look at dwell time, the average amount of time that an intruder can spend concealed inside a compromised network, the average right now is 146 days. So about 5 months. And that difference is striking to me, right? 17 minutes is a national catastrophe, and 146 days is business as usual. And so the question that I want to ask is why, and why the Secret Service is so good at what they do. The Secret Service is an interesting model to look at here because in many ways the president is a lot like a high-value asset in a data center. He's incredibly valuable, incredibly targeted, and incredibly exposed. The Secret Service doesn't get to take the president and put them in a pillbox underneath 1600 West Pennsylvania Avenue and have no one talk to them. The president is always talking to people. And in fact, a huge part of the president's value is that they talk to people and they're exposed. You could say something very similar about a lot of the high-value assets in the data center, right? If you have a database that is driving your billing function, that enables customers to purchase from you, you don't get to wall that off from everything else. It has to be exposed. If you have valuable data or a valuable process, it's almost certainly exposed to the rest of your data center, and chances are a big chunk of its value is because it's so exposed. And so what the Secret Service does, their entire mission is mitigating risk, which is essentially the same thing we do. And so the question is, how do they work and what could we learn from it? When the Secret Service is trying to protect the president, imagine, let's say the president is speaking at an auditorium. The Secret Service runs through several stages to think about how they're going to do this. And I'll talk about this at a pretty high level, as you might imagine. But you can sort of break it down into 4 stages that map surprisingly well to the data center. The first is understand. The Secret Service builds a map and an understanding of the environment where the president is going to be. The second is control. The Secret Service literally physically transforms the environment so that it is not as exposed as it used to be. The third is detection. The Secret Service puts tools in place to detect change in that environment. And the fourth is response. When a change occurs, the Secret Service responds pretty quickly, it turns out. When you put all these together, there's one sort of fact that animates Secret Service security that I think is really interesting here, right? When we think about protecting the president and we think about exposure for the president, we tend to think about this. Agents in dark suits, sunglasses with earpieces, with the suits that are cut extra large that can carry their guns. Actually, a good tip, by the way, if you ever want to know if someone you're talking to in a suit is an agent or not, look to see if their ankle seems cut rather wide, because that's where they put the ankle piece, right? I have been to tailors with agents when they have that conversation with the tailor and they say, look, I need this side to be kind of large. It's a very strange conversation. This is what we think of. We think of these agents standing between the president and the crowd. But the honest truth is that 90% of the security is a lot more like this. 90% of the security for the president happens before the president ever shows up. And that's really important. So if we think about an auditorium where the president's speaking, right, how does this work? How do these processes happen, right? So if you take a look here, we have a simple map. And what the Secret Service does in the understand stage is they identify where the president's going to be, right? That's their high-value asset. That's what they're protecting. Then they identify the locations they care about. So they might have the auditorium. They might have a couple of entryways, right? They're sort of breaking up the space so it's not one big mess. Then they identify all the choke points in the location. And what I mean by choke point is it's a space that an intruder would have to pass through to move through this environment. It might be a doorway, it might be a hallway, it might be a path. And then they identify all the vectors, all the paths that connect them. So they have this map of the location. And they know that anyone who's going to break in is going to have to cross that map, move along those paths, and cross those choke points. Now the problem is that most auditoriums are designed to be extremely open. You want people to be able to get in and get out really easily, which is fine if you're watching a play, but maybe isn't so good if you're trying to protect the president. So the next thing the Secret Service does is they try to understand what are the bare minimum of paths that can be open in order for the president to get in, give his talk, and get out. And then they change the environment. They actually shut down everything else. They do that using locked doors, barricades, rope lines. They'll fence off parts of the auditorium. They might say, up in the corner there, we can't see very well. We don't want someone up there with a gun. Right down in the front row, someone could rush the president. We don't want anyone there. They literally transform the space. So when the Secret Service is done, it doesn't look anything like it did when they showed up. And this is incredibly expensive because we're actually moving physical space around, right? This isn't a network. These are actual barricades they have to set up, right? Doors they have to lock, things they have to change. But the reason they do that is once you do this, the map looks radically different, right? Because here you can sort of look and see what matters. What do you care about? You care about those edges that go from those entryways into the auditorium. You care about those edges that actually connect to the president. If someone gets to one of those points, that is a serious problem. If someone's all the way out at the edge, you care, but you actually care only because they're closer to the things that matter. So then what the Secret Service does is they put detection tools in place. These are things like metal detectors, video cameras, ID checks, but they don't just put them everywhere, right? One of, I think, the most interesting distinctions between the Secret Service and cybersecurity is that if the Secret Service wanted to, they could put a best-in-breed metal detector at every seat in the auditorium. They could network them all up, they could detect every piece of metal in that auditorium, and they could pull it all into a central location, they could filter it all out. They would never, ever do that. Any thoughts as to why? What? Convenience and privacy is a good example, but remember, in this case, you've chosen to come see the president, right? You've given up all your privacy rights while you're in that room. Any other ideas? It's too expensive. They have a pretty big budget. Let's imagine that's not a problem either. False positives and too much data, right? They would find every bit of metal in the auditorium. And a bunch of it would be, I'm carrying a cell phone in my pocket. I've got change in my pocket. I have a metal hip. They would get tons and tons of alerts. A bunch of them would be false positives. And then, in order to figure out what it was, the only solution would be to send out a Secret Service agent to check every alert. And the big part of that problem is Secret Service agents, it turns out, are really expensive, right? In order to be considered for the presidential detail, you have to be a Secret Service agent on the job for 5 years in protection. So that's 5 years of on-the-job training, plus all the courses that lead up to it and all the expertise and training. There aren't that many of them, right? Even if the Secret Service wanted to, even if they could fit one agent in the auditorium for every attendee, there just aren't that many in the world. So a big part of what they're doing is they're trying to take and solve all the simple problems so that the most hard problems can be focused on by their agents, their most expensive resource. So they put detection on the edges that matter the most, because they know that if you have less detection, first, you're going to trust it more. They can focus it in because they know what they're looking for. They're not only going to do that, they're going to put detection in other places as well, around the auditorium, probably around the entire location. Video cameras, metal detectors, all sorts of things. But they recognize that the more constrained and precise the detection, the fewer alerts you get, and the more reliable and trustworthy they are. So they're creating a hierarchy, so that even if they get flooded with alerts, if they get an alert on that edge that's next to the president, they can drop everything else. Right? So they're prioritizing this. And all this sets them up for response. And in response, you've got things like agents, alarms, automatically locking doors, all sorts of things. But the key about response is they've simplified this world and they've tightened it down. Now, the fact that they have blocked all these other paths doesn't mean it's impossible for someone to use one, right? There's no such thing as perfect security. But it's interesting, right? So let's take 3 examples. Here's the 3 ways they might detect something and have to respond. The first is somebody appears at the edge of their map, right? That's exactly what they want. That person then has to move through the environment as the Secret Service has designed it to work and cross all the checkpoints they want. Sure, could that person sneak through everything and get into the president's presence? It's possible, but it's really hard. And the Secret Service has stacked the deck in their favor. They get as many shots as possible. Second, turns out someone was hiding in the auditorium 2 months ago, and they've been hidden there. They've snuck in some other way, and they pop up somewhere in the auditorium where they're not supposed to be. Right? No security is impenetrable. So someone pops up there. Why is this still an advantage for the Secret Service? There's no fear it's a false positive. They've violated established policy. There's no question, what do we do? There's no need to investigate. There's no need to slow down and think about it. The Secret Service can react. And reaction probably means sending someone up there to tackle them, or maybe sending someone up there to shoot them, whatever it might be, but they can move as fast as they need to. So what they're doing is they're saving themselves time. And then there's a third type of problem. And the third type of problem is the hardest one, right? This is an intruder who does exactly what they need to do. They show up, they're very, very smooth, they get through all the security checks, and they're seated in the front row, and then they reach into their pocket. And the question is, are they reaching for a gun? Are they reaching for a cell phone? Are they reaching for a sign? This approach doesn't solve that problem. And in fact, there's no approach that solves that problem, but I'll tell you what it does do. It means the Secret Service agents who are trained to solve that problem can spend all their time just focused on that problem, not anything else. All the other problems are pushed away so that the agents can just look at the crowd and try to understand what's happening and be ready to respond. So you have these 4 stages. And I draw them like this very intentionally because understanding the environment makes control work better. Controlling the environment makes detection work better. And having effective detection makes response work better. So it's a pyramid, and there's almost a trickle-up effect. The further down you invest, the more efficient it is. Any questions about that? No? Okay. I should say, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. It's the only way to get me to stop talking, I've been told. So the question then is, would this work in the data center? And I'll take this in 2 ways. The first is actually, could we do this? And then the second is, why is it hard to do it? So what the Secret Service is essentially doing is they're building a relationship graph of the environment. They have nodes and they have edges, which is what lets them control the space. The data center also has a relationship graph. This is a very simple, completely toy data center in the same way that the auditorium was a very simple example. Essentially, you have a data center with a development and a production environment. You have an HR application with an instance in both, and then you have an ERP application only in dev. First thing you want to do is you want to find the HVAs, just like the Secret Service did. In this context, these are going to be databases that are storing high-value information. We're in an HR application, so this could be customer or employee data information. It could be a PCI environment because you have particularly sensitive data in there. This could be simply the servers that run the system, which means if they go down, the system breaks. And then there are the choke points, and the choke points are all the other servers in the environment. Because the choke points are the pivot points. Because the one consistency, at least that I've seen, and I'd be curious if others agree or disagree, is that every major intrusion I've ever worked involving a large data center has a common denominator, and the common denominator is lateral movement. The intruders get in through a low-value environment, often by phishing an employee, right? And then slipping from their endpoint into dev. And then they move through the environment step by step, server by server, elevating privileges, looking for vulnerabilities that let them try to reach a high-value asset where they can cause damage. They have to move through those servers, so they're essentially the choke points. And then you could say there are edges. And the edges in this case are all the active data flows between all those servers, all the places those servers are actually communicating. But if we remember from the auditorium map, there are actually a lot more than this, right? The auditorium has a lot of places you can move. The data center has far more potentially open connections than most organizations use, and I'll show you some stats on that later. And so we understand this map now, but just like the auditorium, the network is designed to be open, which is great for functionality, problematic for security. So what could we do? Control. It's nice because actually controlling this environment, believe it or not, is way easier than controlling a physical space. You don't need to haul a bunch of barriers in. We can change the nature of it. We can patch vulnerabilities to close some of these. We can segment applications to block traffic. We can limit user access to limit movement through, encrypt data, use strong passwords. All sorts of different ways that we can change this graph. And a simple way to think about this is, we're not going to close everything, right? It still needs to be connected, but we could say, why are there all of these unused pathways that are still open crossing between dev and production? That's a line that we probably care a lot about. We can close them. Why are there pathways between these 2 applications that we aren't using? We can close them. Why are there pathways connecting to our high-value assets that aren't being used? Why are there more connections than necessary there? We can close them. And what this has just done is in the same way as what the Secret Service did, we sort of simplified the graph, right? Notice, I haven't taken away all of those inactive connections. More on that later. But what we have done is we've highlighted, and some things can jump out here, right? What edges do we care most about? What matters on this map? Right? You care about, I mean, what are these doing, right? Edges that cross from dev into prod. Those clearly matter. There's an edge, the edges that connect to our HVAs. Those are going to matter. And then most of all, this edge that goes from dev into production and lands on a high-value asset. What is that doing, right? That may be legitimate traffic. But does it really need to be there? Do we really need to have this wide-open shortcut for an intruder? And so what you will do then is you'll go through and you'll look at these and you'll say, do they all need to be open? And you might conclude, actually, that the connections from dev into production don't be. Because most of the time when I've seen it, they actually don't. Usually it's a leftover artifact from a developer who was building something and didn't close a pathway, and it's still open and chugging away. But you can't close everything, to our point earlier, right? Your high-value assets actually need to connect to things in order to function. So you can't eliminate your exposure. Which moves us to this next stage, which is detection. And in detection, we can use all sorts of different tools. Could be endpoint detection. Could just be employee training to help your employees understand the type of threats they're facing, an IDS. The other thing to remember is that here, the environment changes, which means we're not just looking for threat, we're looking for change, right? So are we monitoring software updates, and do we understand when those changes occur? Do we have an application dependency map so we can see when these changes occur? But you put all this together, and you can focus your detection in the same way the Secret Service did. Focus it at the edges that matter the most, and then you can do more detection that's more generalized. But again, you can recognize and you can prioritize. Using any number of tools that organizations use today, you can prioritize detection from those edges that matter the most, right? Because if that happens, you know you need to act. And we put all of this together, and we move to that response stage. And response is going to be things like forensics, it's going to be containment, orchestration tools to help you respond at scale, building all this together into sort of an adaptive security response so that it changes as the threats change. And just like with the Secret Service, you can imagine three sort of scenarios. The first is you have a bad guy show up where you expect them to, which is in your development environment, right? And now they're going to try to move from that into production, which means they're going to beacon out, they're going to look for paths they can use, and they're going to move through your environment. It doesn't mean that they can never cross that chasm and get into production, right? There's no such thing as perfect security, we all know that. But what it does mean is they're going to spend more time stumbling around your development environment and making noise. So you're stacking the deck to give yourself more chances to catch them. Second situation, we have someone who actually gets into production. Now, when they're in production, right, we have closed down most of these paths. There's still some open, but we know which ones we're using and which ones we don't. So if an intruder uses one we don't usually use, that can send off alarm bells as well. So you are able to sort of set tripwires through this. If they act out of policy, you can react immediately. It's not a question of false positives. They're taking an action that you said shouldn't be permitted. And then the third and the hardest example, right, is an intruder that gets all the way into your production environment, into your highest value application, and knows exactly the pathways you use and surfs them. This doesn't completely solve that. But what it does mean is that even if that's true, they still have to move through the additional detection you've placed around your HVAs. You're still channeling them into the places you want, right? It's certainly not perfect, and nothing is perfect, but it does stack the deck in our favor, which is a lot better than having the deck stacked against us, which is sort of the way it feels sometimes. So we go back to this pyramid, right? You put all these together, and we have this trickle-up effect. But the thing that I think is most interesting about this, and the thing that really struck me about it and why I put this together, is that if you look at the way a lot of organizations think about these stages and invest in them, it looks a lot more like this. Right? In cybersecurity today, we spend a lot of time focused on detection and response. And detection and response is really important. But if you don't have that foundation underneath it, you're at a huge disadvantage. Imagine taking the 5 best Secret Service agents in the world and saying to them, the president's speaking at an auditorium in 20 minutes. I've never been there. You don't have time to go. And I don't have a map. But I tell you what, my cousin Joe saw a play there 6 years ago. And he kind of remembers what it looks like. So go talk to him for 5 minutes and then show up with the president and try to protect him. It's crazy. We would never do that. But if we invest in response and detection without control and understanding, that's essentially what we're doing on the network. So I said I would talk about two parts involving the data center. One is how we could do it, and the second is why we don't. Clearly, this lovely pyramid is not the way most security happens today. And it's not because no one thought of it. It's because the systems that we're working in don't make it easy, right? So I want to talk a little bit about three problems that I've seen that I think make this hard. Are there any questions before I get into this last section? Criticisms? Fruit? Comic asides? No? Okay. Everyone really focused on that happy hour? Yeah, I can understand that. That's fine. So the simplest way to describe the problem is this. This is a map of a network environment that I've mapped since I joined Illumio. You can't even see it, but in the middle there are dots. And each dot represents a workload, a server. And there are about 600 of them. 600, right? Not the hugest thing in the world. Not 10, but not thousands. Anyone want to hazard a guess at how many of those lines are on this map? It's 1.2 million. Right? 1.2 million active data flows. And remember, active data flows. I'm not talking about the potential data flows that are probably permitted in the environment. That's actually a lot more. This is the problem, right? The problem is that the environment is so complicated that it's really hard for us to break it down and understand it and operate inside it. So let me break that down a little bit. Three problems: friction, complexity, and proactive security. Friction is the first one. Security is all about friction. Organizational security is all about friction. Every time that I've seen it, every physical security operation I've ever been involved in has been about friction. And really it's about differentiated friction. By which I mean you want to impose friction on the intruders, but not on the defenders. The biggest problem with the Secret Service analogy is, has anyone here ever gone to see the president speak? Was it convenient? Not particularly? Yeah. Going to see the president speak is like one of the three most annoying things you'll ever do in your life. Completely worth it, but incredibly annoying. You show up 4 hours early, 6 hours early. You stand in line, potentially in the cold, for hours. You're in this huge group of people you go through. You have to send all your information in advance to get a background check. You go through security. You get funneled from this big mass down to this little line. You get sniffed by the dog. You do all these things. You go in, you sit down, and you're there 2 hours before the president shows up. And then the president is 45 minutes late. He comes and speaks, and then he leaves. And then it takes you 2.5 hours to get out because there's all these people and there's only one door out. Is that a reasonable description? Yeah, right? So we can do that with the president. We accept that because it's the president, and we say, all right, I'm going to see this person. I want him to be secure. I'll accept the inconvenience. You can't do that in a business, right? In fact, if you make it 5% more difficult, it doesn't matter how secure it is because everyone just routes around it. So the real question is, how open are these environments to begin with? And what can we do to reduce that exposure without creating that inconvenience? And it turns out, as I would imagine most of you might guess, they tend to be pretty open. So one of the things that I've done since joining Illumio, now that I have some compute power in a team, is to try to map a bunch of these environments and to try to understand how open they are. So this is one environment that we mapped. 100 workloads, pretty small, 100 servers, 245,000 open potential connections. But the real thing to notice here is that of those 245,000, only about 6,500 are being used. In other words, only 3% of those edges we've been showing in those other graphs are being used. Here's another one. It's bigger, 3,500 workloads. Only 0.8% of them are being used. And if you think about it, it's actually not that surprising. Because networks are designed to connect. And if you have a new server open a port inside a network segment, every other server in that network segment can potentially communicate with them. But chances are you don't actually need it to communicate with all of them. So the number of connections in use tends to scale fairly linearly. The number of connections that are potential, I won't say it scales exponentially because everyone says that and doesn't actually know what exponential means, but it certainly scales a lot faster than linearly. If you were the Secret Service, you would go into that 3,500 workload environment and you would close down 99.2% of those connections. Shut it down. And then if you were an engineer working in that environment, it would be super inconvenient, right? Anytime you needed to do something new, you'd have to get permission from somebody. You'd have to put in a change request, and you'd wait for the port to get opened, which means immediately what would happen is every engineer would figure out how to route around it, right? Certainly what I did. But you don't have to go to 99.2%, and that's the point, right? If we could close down 60% of these paths, it would be a huge reduction in the options that an intruder has. Because the more options the intruder has, the faster they can move through the environment, and the more stuff we have to watch. So this first point is friction. Is it possible to impose friction on intruders without imposing it on the defenders? And the answer is yes. The trick, of course, is if you want to close 60% of these paths, you need to know which 60%. So this gets to the second point, which is complexity. All of this comes back to that very first layer of the pyramid, understanding, right? That is the foundation, and if you can't do that, nothing else matters. And we have a very fundamental problem. Has anyone seen, anyone know who Rob Joyce is? You guys know Rob Joyce? He is the former head of NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit, the chief hackers at the NSA, the chief offensive hackers at the NSA. He was recently tapped. He's now cybersecurity coordinator at the White House. But this was his role up until a month ago. A year ago, Rob spoke at Enigma, a public cybersecurity conference, and he gave a public talk. And it's an excellent talk, and the topic of it is essentially as, hi, I'm from the NSA. We're really good at breaking into your systems. Here's what you would need to do to make life hard for me. There are not that many people who can come with that perspective, and it's a remarkable talk. I highly recommend looking it up. It's online. But the refrain of it that he comes back to again and again is really simple, and it's intruders win because intruders know your network better than you do. And that's it. Everything else follows from that. There's a second half to that, right? Which is that means they can control your network better than you can. But as he says over and over again, we tend to know how our networks are supposed to function. That is, how they function when we set them up, or how we thought they functioned when we set them up. Intruders know how they actually function. And in that gap is where all these paths are that we don't recognize, that they can use to move. And the problem is complexity. For years, right, we focused on security at the perimeter. And I think everyone here will agree, right? Perimeter security doesn't solve the problem. It's bad for a lot of reasons. It may be a part of the solution. It's clearly not the whole solution. But there's one advantage to perimeter security. It's really simple. In particular, it's one-dimensional. Traffic is in or it's out. That's actually all you need to understand. I don't need to know what's inside. All I need to know is if it's not on my trusted network, it's bad. And if it's on my trusted network, it's good. And I need to control where it gets through. It's really simple. If you look at the way the Secret Service operates, or indeed, interestingly, if you look at the way any other physical security team operates today, right? Think about the way law enforcement operates. Think about the way the military operates. No one thinks that a perimeter is sufficient any more than we do. They've all figured out how to operate with a porous boundary, which is what we're trying to do. And the problem is, once you go inside an environment, it's not one-dimensional anymore. It's multidimensional. Things have relationships, and the relationships are what matter, because lateral movement is this common denominator. So think about what we use to understand our environments, because I think this is very interesting to me, right? If you look at a security team, if you look at an infrastructure team that's thinking about organizing their environment, is looking at subnets, zones, VLANs, maybe separately as looking at ACLs, they're thinking in terms of IP addresses, they're thinking in terms of host names. And what's striking to me about this is IP addresses tell you some information about the network, where a device might be on the network at a given moment. But they don't tell you anything about what application it's part of, or whether it matters or not, or what it's doing. They're effectively one-dimensional from a security perspective, which means that we're trying to describe a multidimensional environment in one dimension. Host names are my favorite example of this, right? Host names are supposed to be one-dimensional. It's just a name for a host. But none of them are, right? You try to break this up, and we're trying to jam multiple dimensions into a one-dimensional construct because we need them. We need to know what company is it, what application is it, what environment is it in. We need to know this information, but we're doing it in the least efficient way possible. What we really would need is to be able to pick a server and say for that server, what application is it part of? What environment is it part of? What role does it play? Maybe what value does it have? How much do I care about it? Is it really important? Is it not important? What infrastructure is it on or is it behind? Is it in the cloud? Is it on-prem? What operating system is it running, right? These are all the questions we need to know. And it's the difference between that first map that I showed you, which anyone can say, oh, look, it's visibility. I have a map of my environment. And actionable visibility, where you can actually do something with it, where you can actually understand it. So one of the biggest challenges we face, I would argue, in trying to use an approach like this, is we don't know what our environments are that we're defending. And if you look at the history of security strategy, defenders that don't know the details of the environment they're defending lose. Every time. Defenders that do and exploit it tend to win, even against hugely advanced and much more powerful teams. And that gap sort of explains part of what we're dealing with here. So the third piece, proactive security. If you ask any physical security expert, they will tell you that there are two kinds of security. There's proactive and there's reactive. And that defenders lose when they operate reactively. Proactive is before the bad guy shows up. Reactive is catching them after they show up. And the problem with reactive is that the bad guy gets to choose when they show up, which means that in theory they're prepared. We are not. We are surprised and scrambling. No matter how good you are, reactive security is always about trying to catch up. No matter how good you are and how much you invest, at best, you can close the gap. And it's important. We have to close that gap. We need to do that. But you can never get ahead as a defender when you're operating reactively. You get ahead by operating proactively. And when we look at the constructs we use for security, ISO, kill chain, SANS top 20, NIST, the common thread between all these that I think is fascinating is that they're all remarkably reactive. Right? So the kill chain obviously is built around reacting to an intruder and interfering with them. NIST talks about identifying particular threats, protecting against them, detecting them when they show up. Right? Each of these is built around responding to threats. And the concept, sort of like the way of thinking about it, is about responding to threats. So we heavily invest in reaction, in detection and response. And part of this is because I think we sort of told ourselves for years, you have two options. You have prevention and you have detection, right? And we all know prevention doesn't work, or at least doesn't work all the time. And so that's driven us to say, okay, prevention isn't the answer. We have to focus on detection. And if our detection is giving us dirty data, if our detection is making it hard to respond, what was the statistic I saw? The average organization in the United States generates 500 critical security alerts a day. And I'm sure that's probably lowballed, right? And has the capacity to analyze about 4% of them. If that's the problem, if we just invest more in detection, we can solve that. If we invest more in analyzing these things, we can get computer systems that simplify it for us and let us focus on the ones that matter. But what we miss is there's actually a way to do this that security teams have been doing forever, right? And it's proactive. It's about understanding and control. Because if you understand and control your environment, then when you detect, you understand what you're looking at, and you can react better to it. And when you look at the pyramid, right, in my mind, the bottom half of the pyramid is proactive, and the top half is reactive. It's a little bit of a fudge. There's some parts of detection that might actually be proactive, but the point is further down the pyramid is going to be more proactive. So it aligns with the way security teams have been thinking about this problem for a very long time. So the argument that I'm making here, right, is we need to change the way we think about the way we invest in security. Not that reaction, not that response and detection are bad, they're essential, but that by investing at the base of the pyramid, we actually make the top of the pyramid better. And so it's sort of like every dollar you invest at the base actually returns $3 of return, because you get better understanding, but you also get better detection. And I mentioned at the beginning this 17 minutes point. When this story happened at the White House, I had a bunch of friends, because I've been sort of thinking about and trying to build this model for a while, came up to me and said, oh, I guess you have to change your model now. And actually, I think no. I think it's a great example of exactly why this works and how this works. Because the interesting thing about the intruder that spent 17 minutes on the lawn, right, they jumped the fence at the Treasury building, and they set off alarms. And then they moved through the lawn, and they set off a bunch of other alarms. Some of the alarms had been disabled because they were generating too many alerts. And some of them actually threw alerts, but nobody noticed or nobody paid attention. Sound familiar? But for all of that, when they reached the door, they were caught. Right? They still actually were stopped, because the point of a control-based security model isn't that you don't make mistakes. You actually make mistakes all the time. The point is that you're allowed to make mistakes, and you get to make mistakes, and that you force the intruder to never make a mistake. One of my most interesting memories, so when you're investigating cybercrimes, when you're investigating crimes, it's really hard to be a criminal. A lot of reasons for that, but one reason is you can never screw up. One mix-up is really all you need to get caught. Every slip you make could be your last one, so you have to be perfect. And there are people who are really good, but no one's perfect. And so when you're operating outside the law, you have this problem in that you're sort of always at a disadvantage. If we're operating reactively as defenders, that's the side we've chosen. If we screw up once, the intruder slips through. But if you operate proactively, you change it, so that then they have to screw up. They have to keep being perfect, and if they slip up even once, then they'll get through. There's another story, actually, about the Secret Service, which is a different one, which is much scarier. The president in 2014 was at the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. Did anyone hear this story? He was on an elevator, and it turns out that the guard who was on the elevator with him, who was controlling the elevator, who was carrying a pistol, had a felony record. And no one knew. And he started taking pictures of the president with his cell phone, and he wouldn't stop. And they finally had to basically restrain him and move him away. So you have an individual in the presence of the president with a loaded weapon, acting strangely with a record of some kind, right? This is like a very concerning set of events. And the interesting thing is the CDC actually gave the Secret Service records of who was carrying and who was who, and they didn't do the lookup. So you contrast these two, right? 17 minutes on the lawn, gets caught at the door, or standing in the elevator with the president. It's obvious which one is scarier. And the difference between them is that in the first one, the controls held. The environment was controlled, which means this person running through it kept having to be perfect and eventually screwed up. In the other example, the controls didn't hold. And so the person was able to slide right through to be standing next to the president. And when you think about a lot of the breaches we see today, when you think about 146 days, what we're seeing is environments we don't control. And so when I think about how to get ahead of these breaches, when I think about Sony, when I think about DNC, when I think about OPM, and when I think about malware threats like the underlying SMB vulnerability everyone's sort of spun up about right now, all of these are about lateral movement. And if we can refocus at the base of the pyramid, I think it does a lot towards putting the odds back in our favor as defenders. And I think I'm maybe a couple minutes early. How'd I do? Brilliant. Look at that. That's everything that I've got. I'm happy to answer questions if you have any or talk further. Question? Everyone's like, ooh, I might want to ask a question, but if I ask, then everyone has to wait to go to the happy hour. I understand that. I'll give you one more chance, and then if you don't have any questions, you can come up to me afterwards. All right.